from the 1880s. And then by the time you get to the late 1890s now, both these movements tend to kind of fray and fall apart, right? And then by the time you get to the turn of the century, even people are claiming to be nationalists or liberals, it's very difficult to see the difference between the two, right? There was a Maniga, who was a leader of the nationalist movement, who leaves Haiti and goes into exile in Paris and dies in 1900. And that's often seen as a kind of ending of that, even though people continue to use the rhetoric of that afterwards. But especially when you get to, say, the 1905, to 1908, the era of Nord-Alexis, even people are writing and saying that they're nationalists or liberal. They're almost saying the exact same thing. It's very hard to distinguish.
Okay.
Sure.
Most of those nationalists, they wrote in French.
Yes.
And have they ever considered Creole of the nationalisms?
It's a really good question, and I think it goes all the way down to even the later period as well. I mean, all of these guys are writing in French. Nationalists, Noirs, all of liberals, they're all writing in French. And we know that the majority of the Haitian population, especially, wouldn't be able to read the French. So in many ways, it's a conversation among themselves that they're having, and that's why I said at the beginning, it's really kind of elite. It exists in this kind of universe of political elites. I don't know how it changes because they're not writing in Creole. I do know by the time you get to the 1940s, in the period of the La Rouche and others, they would actually translate those papers, those newspapers, into Creole. They have these public readings, which is something of that era, not unique to Haiti. Where somebody would stand up somewhere in a public square and take the newspaper of the day, and everyone would gather and they'd read the news to them in the language that people could understand. That's how people would get the news. Of course, that lends itself to all sorts of variation, because sometimes somebody can translate it in a way that they want you to hear it this way. Where you really see it, this is why someone like Fignole becomes popular, is that by the 1940s, radio becomes important in Haiti. And it becomes now a vehicle for those who can't read or who can't even read in French, for people to understand. They turn on the radio and they can hear all of the political debates. Someone like Fignole gave most of that stuff in Creole. And so people just gravitated to him and they could relate instantly to what he's saying. But the condition of the idea of writing in French and so on is almost a way of almost expressing your erudition, your way of being privileged enough to read because you have this command of the language. There's a whole language politics in it. So even if you're arguing on behalf of the majority who can't speak it, the fact that you can do so is important. People feel that you are bestowed to lead them because of that, especially in that early period. And you see this elsewhere as well. I don't know if that answers your question.
Definitely.
Okay.
Yes, could you say something about the political programs, if they had one? Like what were they advocating? Land reform, usage of Creole, education, and what was the difference between them, like the socialists and the communists?
Yeah, the idea of language was something that was more of a bigger issue for, like, say, the indigenous writers who were writing, the kind of nationalist writing of the 1920s and so on. Someone like Émile Rouméan was a big advocate of using Creole, and so that was important. But as far as the political groups are concerned, Fignole and MOP and that group tended to have an idea of somewhat idealistic view of a rearrangement of power relations in Haiti. So instead of having a kind of bourgeois that tended to be light-skinned, etc., controlling the kind of the main apparatus of the state and society, they should be taken over by other groups. Particularly, we tended to be more in terms of the popular groups. People like Estime or even Adu Valley would argue that it's people of the black middle class should take over. So their political program was one in which was less populist in its outlook. The socialists did have certain reformist programs. In fact, they tended to be the most extensive of these radical groups in putting forward these plans. They had agricultural plans. There was a man named Rigaud, who was one of the socialists, who was also an agronomist, who would put forward a certain agricultural plans for the development of Haitian agriculture during this period. Labor relations and issues related to labor was something shared by several of these groups, MOP, as well as the Socialist Party. Had some plans and programs for developing labor in unionization in Haiti. Estime as well. They created a labor board, etc., which was led to a Ministry of Labor. But none of these things really had a chance to develop because of the fierceness of the competition. And so they never really grew. There were economic plans as well in the 1950s that Magor led, but there was a lot of focus on preserving power, getting power and then preserving it. And so a lot of this other stuff was difficult to implement. It's not that they were without programs. Yeah.
But they didn't implement that.
It was, no, I mean, some were. I mean, as I mentioned, like, SCA did implement certain labor reform programs. He increased the minimum wage, created a Ministry of Labor, etc. There's a program that even predates the 40s to develop tourist industry in Haiti. And that accelerates a bit during the 40s and the 50s. So there were attempts to do it, but the success of those measures couldn't really take off.
Could you talk a little bit about how the resistance movements affected people living outside of Port-au-Prince?
Yeah. Always the question that comes up, right? To what extent this was
Really a countrywide kind of movement, or were they
just,
happening in vacuum?
Most of it is really, most of these developments are happening in the urban centers in Port-au-Prince. You saw in the quote that I had on the board by Jacome, he said 98%. And they'd always give these inflated figures of their reach, but it wasn't really that as wide as they would make it seem. During this period, there was still a great deal of disconnect between the provinces and the capital, especially when you get a stronger centralization in Port-au-Prince. And so as a result, these different groups that are emerging are not directly, some of them claim to be, and as time goes on, they do have more inroads into other provinces. But it doesn't really develop. It would, you do have, leaders in these different provinces who are organizing, right? But they never really achieve. Maybe it's because, obviously, I think probably because they're not as close to the center of power, where they can use that now as a vehicle for expanding their popularity. But you had Daniel Fignol being so incredibly popular, but that's really in Port-au-Prince and the area around. There's a man named, his first name escapes me, but his last name is Larac, who was also a popular leader in the north of Haiti during that same period. But you don't really hear about him as much because he doesn't have as much of a reach as Fignol. So you do have that, and then there's always, of course, the lip service that is paid to, what I'm doing is on behalf of all Haitians and so on that people say, that they're incorporating them into their programs. But how directly that's being done is not as real as what they say.
And during that time, do you start to see any exchange of, or payment, let's say compensation for people getting involved in the resistance movements, protests, things like that?
By
That by whoever wants people to gather, I mean, which has become pretty common in various countries throughout the world.
It's often said that, and I think more work needs to be done on the cacos, but it's often said that the cacos serve that function, that they're essentially mercenaries for hire. And, you know, and that this myth of nationalism of Shaman Karat and so on comes later, that their longer history is of groups that, you know, foreign companies come in, investors who want to circumvent certain laws in Haiti to get what they want, and they need to get something done. They'll pay off these groups who lead some sort of uprising and so on. By the time you get to the post-occupation period, I'm not certain how much that functions. It exists, no doubt it exists, but the functioning of it is
With more integrity
difficult.
then.
Yeah, because I mean, you know, somebody like Fignoli, his appeal, which was really reached out to people who were deprived, who didn't have access. That's a powerful appeal, and he doesn't need to pay people to get that. I mean, you know, anything that in a situation like that promises some sort of class reversal would bring people in.
Yeah. If I could add, one of the things I think is important that you raise in the book is how during this period you have a growing migration from the rural area to Port-au-Prince,
Exactly.
right? So this is how you get a growing number of, you know, people, you know, the popular presence
true.
into politics.
Exactly. Right.
I have more of a practical question, and Brooke will like this because she's like my source for room. But one, what was your experience like doing research in Haiti? And then two, because you just mentioned it with the radio, are there archives of radio recordings?
Yeah.
Or do they, or anyone can also jump in, you might know, but.
Yeah. It's challenging to do work in Haiti. It is. But you know, there is material there.
Yeah, no,
So, you know,
that I
but,
learned.
yeah, but it is challenging. It takes a great, you know, some degree of, you know, just stick to it to get it. But you will. There's a lot of stuff there that you can go through. You know, my personal experience was that, you know, it involved going there several times to kind of find information, and the information for this sort of thing, as I do in this book, is just scattered, you know, and it's really hard. You're not going to go one place and say, well, here's what's I needed. It's really painstaking, where Chantal will tell you, because she also works on this period, so she knows. It's very painstaking, and you have to really be stitching things from all these different things that you don't even know. And also going beyond certain myths and certain kinds of easy answers that people have put up for so long about this era, and I'm sure it cuts from many different eras in Haitian history. And that makes it a bit challenging, but you know, that's a thing that you know, it's not the U.S. National Archives. Sit down and so on. It's not that at all. But you know, it's rewarding. In the end, it's rewarding, because even if you can't see the story unfolding, the little bits you're getting is giving you such a sense of a time, such a sense of a moment in Haiti's history that feels so distant to us now, and you're able to pull that out, and even if it's not the concrete smoking gun you're looking for, that takes you back and it shapes your view. Radio archives, I don't know of many that exist. There were some. Radio came on in Haiti during the occupation, during the 1920s. Haiti was one of the first Caribbean countries to get radio, and that's what the United States brought to Haiti. I don't know how much of that stuff was kept. Some of the music you can find, some of the music of that era. But in terms of broadcasts, I looked for some, I couldn't find them. What I did find, which was helpful, was that in some places, like in newspapers, you can find transcripts of important broadcasts.
Okay.
And those transcripts give you a sense of what was said. But the audio recording is not something you'll be able to put your hands on easily at all.
Yeah.
Can you also briefly just mention tourism, because you brought up the development of the tourism ministry, and I think that's it's quite interesting. I think for people who don't realize that there was a time where Haiti was the place to be, where rum was flowing freely and the parties were happening, and this was all happening alongside all of these other interesting political and social things. Can you talk a little bit about those periods and
Sure.
and how they kind of function parallel to
Yeah.
one another?
Yeah, I mean, tourism, especially North American tourism to the Caribbean, expands a lot during this period in the 1930s, especially after the post-war period. That's when you have a lot more U.S. and Canadian visitors coming to North America. Cheaper travel, cheaper airfare. You don't have to go by boat anymore. There are lots of planes that are starting to fly there. So it creates an opportunity for these different governments to develop their tourist industries. And Haiti was, Haitian leaders, despite all their other flaws, they were wise to that. They were wise to the potential that tourism had to economic development in the country. A tourist board had been set up in the 1930s, but tourism really begins to take off in the late 1940s, thereabout. Underestimate. It expands with Magua to a certain degree in the 1950s. You have more and more visitors coming to Haiti. Haiti, like its neighbors, Cuba, Havana, and Jamaica. Not Kingston so much at that point, but other parts of the island of Jamaica, Portland, and in the west become popular tourist destinations. So in order to try and attract that market, the Haitian government from the late 40s builds new hotels in Haiti. Some hotels that we see in Haiti today have a history dating back that far, of the 40s. They try and improve the kind of facade, the look of parts of Haiti. They also market the folklore of Haiti as an attraction for tourists. Right? So you can come to Haiti and the artwork, the crafts, other kinds of parts of Haitian culture are also marketed. And Haitians would also travel and support that kind of exchange to the United States as well. So there was definitely a lot of attention being paid to it. Perhaps the highlight of it is the Bicentenary Exposition in 1949-1950, which Estimé was really the architect of that, which was celebrating the 200th anniversary of Port-au-Prince as a city. And so the redevelopment project of parts of the city was done with a view of bringing people in and then creating this new image of Haiti as a tourist spot that would then make other people come in to Haiti, kind of increase tourism. So it had potential, it definitely did. Haiti has everything all the other Caribbean countries have. I mean, why shouldn't it have developed tourism? It's got the sand, surf, sea, and all this other stuff, and of course a rich culture. It didn't really continue much on the Duvalier period, for obvious reasons, I think.
It's hard not to say anything about Aristide.
Yeah.
He was such an eloquent Creole speaker. Could that be part of what got him closer to the Haitian people?
Partly, yes, definitely. I mean, it was, his eloquence is definitely a great thing, but also his understanding of Haiti's history, and I mean, he's a phenomenal speaker. There's no question about it. He's phenomenal. And I once saw Aristide give a talk in Jamaica, where I'm based, and he gave a talk about Haiti's connection with Jamaica. And he gave that talk. What he said was about it. He was talking about other things, but that part, which was the first 2 minutes of his talk, was the best history I've ever heard about Haiti's connection from before the revolution coming straight up. And it was just so well said, so well put. And he hit all the right notes and everybody was just spellbound. So he definitely has that gift. There's no question about it. And that gift can sometimes be a kind of negative force as much as an asset to a leader. And that gift was something he used and could expand. And he understood Haiti beyond Port-au-Prince, right? And he knew how to bring in people from different forces, different parts and provinces of Haiti. So I think that's definitely a strength, but also it's a moment. A lot of these leaders arise out of a moment that facilitates it, right? A moment of crisis produces this, or allows the space for a leader like Aristide or Fignole, or even Duvalier. Obviously had no charisma compared to these other people, but they emerge at this particular moment, and that moment becomes critical in shaping how they are received, right? And Aristide recognized it. The good leaders always, the ones who can develop it, always recognize it when they have it, and they recognize it when the time is right, and they run with that. And he did. He definitely did, and that's how he could galvanize so much support.
Was he trying to give the Creole language another status?
In some ways he was, but I wouldn't necessarily give him credit for that, because I think that was happening long before him. And he was definitely tapping into the people using Creole, yes, that's for sure. But Fignole did it. There are people before Fignole. That guy was on Haitian radio, Zosal Nav, if you know who that was.